Picture a map of Europe in 1588. England sits isolated on the edge of the Atlantic, a small Protestant island surrounded by Catholic superpowers. Spain controls half the known world. Their empire stretches from the Philippines to Peru, from Mexico to the Netherlands. And King Philip II of Spain has just assembled the largest invasion fleet in human history. 130 ships, 30,000 men, enough firepower to flatten London in a week. Standing between that armada and England's complete destruction was a single warship. Not the biggest, not the newest, but the one that would change naval warfare forever and accidentally create the golden age of piracy. The Ark Royal was a floating revolution, and the man who commanded her during England's darkest hour would prove that size doesn't win naval battles. Speed does, maneuverability does, and a captain willing to rewrite every rule of engagement his enemies expected. This is the story of how one warship saved England from invasion, humiliated the greatest naval power on Earth, and accidentally taught pirates how to win. The Ark Royal wasn't supposed to be a warship at all. Sir Walter Raleigh commissioned her in 1586 as a private vessel. Think about that for a second. A privateer, a glorified government-approved pirate, built one of the most advanced ships of the age with his own money. Raleigh understood something most naval commanders didn't. The old way of naval combat was dying. For centuries, warships were essentially floating castles, massive, heavily armored, designed to crash into enemy vessels, grapple alongside, and let soldiers pour across like a land battle at sea. The Spanish loved this approach. They had the best infantry in Europe. Why wouldn't they want naval combat to be just another infantry fight? But Raleigh saw the future differently. He designed the Ark Royal as a gun platform, long, lean, fast. She carried 55 guns across 4 decks. Her hull sat low in the water compared to the towering Spanish galleons. She could turn faster, respond to wind changes quicker, and most importantly, she could keep her distance while pounding enemy ships with cannon fire. The ship was 100 feet long with a beam of 37 feet, small by Spanish standards. The Spanish flagship, the San Martin, was nearly twice her size, but the Ark Royal could sail circles around her. Here's where it gets interesting. Raleigh built the ship for exploration and privateering. He wanted to raid Spanish treasure fleets in the Caribbean, not fight a full naval battle. But by 1587, England was running out of time and running out of money. Queen Elizabeth the Fawn needed warships. Raleigh needed cash. So he sold the Ark Royal to the Crown for £5,000, roughly $7 million today. The Queen immediately placed her under the command of Lord Howard of Effingham, the Lord High Admiral of England. Howard wasn't a sailor by trade, he was an aristocrat, a politician, the kind of commander who'd normally sit in the capital and let junior officers do the actual fighting. But Howard understood one critical thing. He didn't know naval warfare as well as his subordinates, so he listened to them. And the man he listened to most was Sir Francis Drake. Francis Drake was everything Philip II of Spain hated. A commoner, a pirate, a Protestant. And worst of all, he was effective. Drake had spent years raiding Spanish colonies, stealing their gold, and humiliating their navy. He'd sailed around the world, the first Englishman to do so, returning with a ship loaded with Spanish treasure. He knew Spanish tactics better than most Spanish admirals because he'd been fighting them his entire career, usually while outnumbered and outgunned. The Spanish had a bounty on Drake's head, 20,000 ducats, roughly $4 million in today's money. Philip II called him El Drake, the dragon. Spanish mothers threatened their children with stories about him, and Spanish admirals had nightmares about encountering his ships because Drake didn't fight fair. He didn't follow the rules. He attacked at night. He used fire. He targeted weak points. He won ugly. When Drake came aboard the Ark Royal, he immediately understood what Raleigh had built. This wasn't a castle. It was a predator. fast enough to choose when to engage, heavily armed enough to punish any ship that couldn't escape. Drake had spent his career fighting from exactly this kind of disadvantage against larger Spanish ships. Now he had the superior vessel. But Drake also understood something deeper. The Spanish expected him to fight like a gentleman, close ranks, exchange broadsides at point-blank range, let the best gunners win. Drake had no intention of giving them that fight. He was going to use the Ark Royal exactly the way he'd used his smaller ships in the Caribbean, as a weapon of harassment, exhaustion, and psychological warfare. But England's situation was desperate. Philip II wasn't just sending a fleet, he was sending an invasion force. The plan was simple and terrifying. The Spanish Armada would sail up the English Channel, link up with a massive Spanish army waiting in the Netherlands under the Duke of Parma, ferry that army across to England, and crush the Protestant heretics once and for all. 30,000 men in the fleet, another 30,000 waiting in the Netherlands, against England's entire standing army of maybe 15,000. If the Spanish got those armies onto English soil, the war was over. In May 1588, the Spanish Armada left Lisbon. 130 ships in a crescent formation so massive it took hours to pass any single point on the coast. The Spanish called it the Enterprise of England. Philip called it the Invincible Armada, not as propaganda, but as a statement of fact. Nothing afloat could challenge this fleet, not the English, not the French, not anyone. The Duke of Medina Sidonia commanded the Armada. He was a capable administrator, but a terrible choice for naval command. He got seasick, he had no naval combat experience, and he knew both of these facts, which is why he'd begged Philip not to give him the job. Philip gave it to him anyway because Medina Sidonia was loyal and aristocratic, and those qualities mattered more than competence in the Spanish court. The Armada's strategy was straightforward: sail to the Netherlands, pick up Parma's army, invade England. Don't stop for anything. Don't get drawn into battles with the English fleet. Just maintain formation and complete the mission. Medina Sidonia had strict orders. Do not break formation. Do not chase English ships. Do not allow any vessel to separate from the main fleet. The crescent formation was defensive. As long as it held, the English couldn't penetrate it. And as long as the English couldn't penetrate it, they couldn't stop the Armada from reaching its destination. It was a solid plan, conservative, cautious, built on the assumption that the English would fight the old way, trying to close distance and board Spanish ships. Francis Drake had other ideas. The English spotted the Armada off Cornwall on July 19, 1588. Howard immediately took the fleet out to meet them. 55 English ships against 130 Spanish vessels. The size difference was staggering. The English were outnumbered, outgunned, and defending their homeland against the most powerful empire on earth. But the English had the Ark Royal, and they had wind. The first engagement happened off Plymouth. The Spanish expected the English to try ramming their way into the crescent formation. Instead, the English ships, led by the Ark Royal, stayed at range and opened fire. They kept their distance, they maneuvered constantly, and they aimed for a very specific target on each Spanish ship. The rigging. Drake had spent years fighting Spanish galleons. He knew their weakness. They were slow. Once you damaged their sails and rigging, they became floating targets. And the Spanish tactics required the fleet to stay together. If individual ships fell behind because of damaged sails, the whole Armada had to slow down or abandon them. The Ark Royal led the English fleet in a new kind of naval warfare: shoot and move, damage and retreat. Never close enough for the Spanish to board, never far enough away to let them escape. For 8 days, the English harassed the Spanish up the English Channel in what historians now call the running battle. The Spanish were furious. This wasn't how naval combat worked. The English were supposed to close in. They were supposed to board and fight like men. Instead, they were acting like pirates, darting in, taking shots, vanishing before the Spanish could respond. But it was working, Every day, Spanish ships fell behind, some with damaged rigging, some taking on water from hull damage. The English picked them off, not in dramatic one-on-one duels, but through exhaustion, through attrition, through a revolutionary understanding that range was a weapon. By July 27th, the Armada reached Calais on the French coast. They'd made it. They were within striking distance of the Netherlands. All they had to do was wait for Parma's army to load onto barges and cross the channel. But there was a problem. Parma wasn't ready. His army was still gathering. His barges weren't prepared. The Dutch rebels, who hated Spain, were blockading the ports. Parma needed time. The Armada anchored at Calais, 120 ships now, 10 having been lost or sent back to Spain. Still enough to complete the mission. They just needed to hold their position and wait. Francis Drake saw his opportunity. At midnight on August 7th, the Spanish sentries spotted 8 ships sailing toward the anchored Armada. Not warships, merchant vessels, old, battered, and on fire. Fire ships were an old tactic. Load a ship with anything flammable, light it on fire, aim it at enemy ships, and let wind and current do the rest. In theory, the enemy would just tow the fire ships away or sink them before they hit anything important. But these weren't normal fire ships. Drake had loaded them with gunpowder barrels set to explode. The moment they crashed into the Spanish fleet, they'd detonate. It was psychological warfare. The Spanish had no way of knowing which approaching fire was just burning wood and which was a floating bomb. Panic spread through the anchored fleet. Captains cut their anchor cables to escape quickly. Ships scattered in every direction. The famous crescent formation broke apart, and once it broke, it couldn't reform. The Spanish had no way to coordinate in the dark with ships fleeing in all directions. Drake's fire ships didn't actually hit any Spanish vessels. They burned out harmlessly offshore. But the damage was done. The Armada's formation, its only real defensive advantage, was shattered. When dawn broke on August 8th, the Spanish fleet was scattered along the coast. Individual ships, small groups, none in communication, none in formation, and sailing straight toward them was the English fleet, led by the Ark Royal. The Battle of Gravelines was the first modern naval battle in history. The Spanish still thought they could reform and grapple with English ships if they got close enough. The English had no intention of getting close. The Ark Royal led the attack. Howard kept his ships at range around 100 yards, close enough for accurate cannon fire, but too far for the Spanish to board. The English ships would sail alongside Spanish galleons, unload broadsides into their hulls, then tack away before the Spanish could respond. The Spanish were helpless. Their big guns couldn't depress low enough to hit English ships at close range. Their superior infantry was useless because the English never closed for boarding. And their damaged sails from 8 days of running battles meant they couldn't maneuver to escape. For 8 hours, the English pounded the Spanish fleet. 5 Spanish ships sank. More were captured. Thousands of Spanish soldiers drowned or died from English cannon fire. But the real defeat wasn't the ships lost. It was the realization that spread through the Spanish fleet. They couldn't win this fight, not with their tactics, not against this enemy. Medina Sidonia made the only decision he could. He ordered the Armada to retreat north around the top of Scotland and sail home via the Atlantic. The invasion was over. Parma's army would never board the ships. England would not be conquered. But the Armada's nightmare was just beginning. The weather that had favored the English during the running battle turned against the Spanish during their retreat. Storms battered the fleet as it rounded Scotland. Ships that had been damaged at Gravelines couldn't handle the rough seas. They broke apart, sank, crashed into rocks. Of the 130 ships that left Spain, fewer than 70 made it home. 15,000 men dead, not from battle, from storms, disease, and starvation during the long retreat around the British Isles. The Ark Royal had barely been scratched. She'd fired thousands of cannon rounds. She'd led the fleet for 9 days of continuous action, and she'd proven that the future of naval warfare belonged to fast, maneuverable gun platforms, not slow, heavily armored castles. But the story doesn't end there, because the tactics Drake perfected on the Ark Royal didn't stay with the Royal Navy. They spread to privateers, to merchants, and eventually to pirates. Here's what nobody expected. The defeat of the Spanish Armada didn't just save England. It broke Spain's control over the seas. For decades, Spanish treasure fleets had sailed from the Americas to Europe with minimal resistance. The Spanish Navy protected them. Pirates and privateers could harass individual ships, but they couldn't challenge Spain's overall maritime dominance. After 1588, that changed. Spain's navy was shattered, their prestige was destroyed, and every pirate in the Caribbean had just watched a small English fleet defeat the largest invasion force in history using tactics any fast ship could copy. Stay at range, target the rigging, never let them close, win through maneuverability, not size. These tactics became the foundation of Caribbean piracy for the next century. The golden age of piracy, roughly 1650 to 1730, was built on the lessons Drake taught at Gravelines. Pirates used small, fast sloops and brigantines. They avoided ship-to-ship combat when they could. They targeted vulnerable merchants, not warships. And they won through speed and surprise, not through force. Let me be specific about how this worked. A Spanish treasure galleon in 1600 might carry 500 soldiers and crew, heavily armed, built like a fortress, but slow, maybe 6 knots in good wind. A pirate sloop with 30 men could sail at 12 knots. The pirate would approach from downwind, fire a broadside into the galleon's rigging, then tack away before the Spanish could return fire. Repeat, repeat again. After 3 or 4 passes, the galleon's sails were shredded. It couldn't escape, it couldn't maneuver. And now those 500 soldiers were trapped on a floating target. The pirate captain would sail alongside, just out of musket range, and demand surrender. The Spanish had 2 choices: surrender and live, or fight and die slowly from cannon fire. Most surrendered, because the pirates had learned from Drake that you don't have to destroy a ship to defeat it. You just have to make fighting more expensive than surrendering. The pirate captains who terrorized the Spanish Main in the 1600s and 1700s were doing exactly what the Ark Royal did in 1588. They were rejecting the old rules of naval combat and writing new ones. Rules that favored the small and fast over the big and slow. Rules that prioritized psychological warfare over brute force. Even the famous pirate flag, the Jolly Roger, was a form of psychological warfare pioneered by Drake. The English flew specific flags during the Armada campaign to signal their intentions. Pirates adapted this. The Jolly Roger sent a clear message: surrender now or face a fight you can't win. Just like Drake's fire ships at Calais. Give the enemy a choice, make surrender look rational. Win without firing a shot if possible. The Ark Royal served the Royal Navy for another 40 years after the Armada. She fought in raids against Spain. She protected English merchant ships. She trained the next generation of English naval officers who would build the British Empire. But her real legacy was the tactical revolution she represented. Before 1588, naval combat was about boarding and hand-to-hand fighting. After 1588, it was about gunnery and maneuverability. Every major naval power copied the English approach. France, the Dutch, even Spain eventually. Ship design changed fundamentally. Galleons got smaller and faster. The ratio of length to beam increased, making ships more hydrodynamic. Gun decks multiplied. By 1650, a typical warship carried guns on 3 decks instead of 2, with lighter cannons positioned higher for better range and accuracy. Sail plans became more complex to allow better maneuvering. Ships added more masts, more sails, and more sophisticated rigging systems that let crews adjust to wind changes in seconds instead of minutes. Look at the evolution. In 1580, a typical Spanish galleon was short, wide, and tall, built to carry cargo and soldiers. By 1650, the standard warship of any navy was long, narrow, and low, built to carry guns and sail fast. The Ark Royal was the prototype for that evolution. Every improvement made between 1588 and 1650 was an attempt to do what she did: combined firepower with speed. By 1650, the old-style galleon was obsolete. The new warship was a direct descendant of the Ark Royal, long, low, heavily armed, and built for speed. The famous ships of the line that dominated naval warfare through the 1800s were just bigger, more refined versions of the Ark Royal's design philosophy. This wasn't just about warships. Merchant vessels adopted the same principles. The famous East India Company ships that dominated global trade in the 1600s and 1700s were designed to outrun pirates, not outfight them. They had gun decks for defense. They had sophisticated sail plans for speed. They were the Ark Royal's children, built for commerce instead of war, but using the same revolutionary design concepts. Even the language of naval warfare changed. Before the Armada, admirals talked about closing with the enemy and boarding. After the Armada, they talked about broadsides, ranging, and line of battle. The vocabulary shifted because the tactics shifted. You can track the revolution in naval thinking just by reading battle reports from before and after 1588. It's like reading accounts from two different worlds. Spain didn't take the Armada's defeat lightly. They tried two more invasion attempts, one in 1596, another in 1597. Both were destroyed by storms before they reached England. The Spanish called these storms the Protestant wind, as if God himself was defending England against Catholic invasion. But storms weren't the real problem. The problem was that Spain kept trying to fight the old way. Bigger ships, more soldiers, the same tactics that had worked for decades. And the English kept fighting the new way. Faster ships, better gunnery, tactics borrowed from pirates. By 1600, Spain's dominance was over. They still had an empire. They still had treasure fleets. But they no longer controlled the seas. English privateers raided Spanish colonies with impunity. Dutch rebels broke away and formed their own republic. France saw an opportunity and built its own navy using English tactics. The world Spain controlled in 1588 was gone by 1600, and the warship that started that collapse was the Ark Royal. The Ark Royal was eventually deemed too old for frontline service and was laid up in 1636. 50 years of service, dozens of battles, and not once defeated in combat. She'd become a legend in her own time. Sailors considered it an honor to serve aboard her. Admirals studied her design, and England had become a naval power because of the revolution she represented. When she was finally scrapped in 1638, pieces of her timber were saved and used in other ships, a tradition that continues in the Royal Navy to this day. The name Ark Royal has been carried by 5 more British warships, including an aircraft carrier that served in World War II. But the original Ark Royal, Raleigh's privately built warship that became England's savior, remains unique. She was built by a pirate, commanded during England's darkest hour by another pirate, and she taught the world that the future of naval warfare belonged to speed, maneuverability, and firepower. Not coincidentally, those same qualities defined successful pirates for the next century and a half. The defeat of the Spanish Armada changed more than naval tactics. It changed the balance of power in Europe. Protestant England survived. The Dutch won their independence. Spain's decline began. France rose, and the stage was set for the colonial competition that would define the next 3 centuries. None of that happens if the Armada succeeds. If those 30,000 soldiers reach English soil, Elizabeth the Fenton probably dies. England becomes Catholic again or gets absorbed into the Spanish Empire. There's no British Empire, no English colonies in North America. The entire trajectory of Western history changes. And standing between that alternate history and the one we got was a 100-foot warship built by a privateer who just wanted to raid Spanish treasure ships. The Ark Royal didn't just save England, she accidentally created the conditions for the golden age of piracy. She proved that small, fast, heavily armed ships could defeat much larger opponents. She established tactics that would be copied by every pirate captain from Henry Morgan to Blackbeard. And she showed that the old rules of warfare weren't laws of nature. They were just traditions. And traditions could be broken. Here's the strangest part of this story. The Ark Royal was designed by a pirate, commanded by a pirate, used tactics that would be perfected by pirates. And her victory over the Spanish Armada created the golden age of piracy that plagued European shipping for over a century. Spain lost more ships to pirates between 1588 and 1730 than they lost to any European navy. Those pirates were using tactics pioneered by Francis Drake on the Ark Royal. Fast ships, long-range gunnery, never close for boarding unless you had overwhelming advantage. Target the rigging, disable, don't destroy. The Royal Navy spent the 1700s hunting pirates who fought exactly like Drake fought. The same Navy that honored Drake as a hero and preserved the Ark Royal's name through 5 more warships. The irony was apparently lost on them, but pirates understood. They knew where their tactics came from. They knew why small, fast ships could defeat larger, slower ones. They'd watched European navies prove it in battle after battle. And they applied those lessons in the Caribbean, along the African coast, in the Indian Ocean, anywhere a slow merchant ship was vulnerable to a fast predator. The Ark Royal's legacy wasn't just a British victory over Spain. It was a manual for asymmetric naval warfare that worked for anyone with a fast ship and good guns. English privateers used it, Dutch rebels used it, French corsairs used it, and pirates used it better than anyone. The Ark Royal was never the biggest warship afloat, never the most famous, never the most decorated, but she was the most important. She proved that naval warfare had fundamentally changed, that speed and firepower could defeat size and armor, that old tactics were obsolete, and that a single well-designed ship, competently commanded, could change history. She saved England from invasion, destroyed Spanish naval dominance, established tactics that defined naval warfare for centuries, and accidentally created the conditions for the golden age of piracy. Not bad for a ship that started as a privateer's personal project. The next time you watch a pirate movie and see a small, fast ship outmaneuvering a larger opponent, you're watching the legacy of the Ark Royal. Every time a naval battle focuses on long-range gunnery instead of boarding actions, that's the Ark Royal's influence. Every time a smaller force defeats a larger one through superior tactics and technology, they're following the playbook Drake wrote in the English Channel in 1588. The Spanish called their fleet the Invincible Armada. History proved them wrong, and the ship that proved them wrong was a 100-foot revolutionary that changed naval warfare forever and accidentally launched an age of pirates. If you want to see how another English captain used these same tactics to build a legend, that video is on screen now. And if you made it this far, you're the kind of person who actually cares about the stories behind the stories. Subscribe. I cover naval history, pirate tactics, and the moments that changed warfare every week. I'll see you in the next one.